Good afternoon all, and welcome to our ESG session, our session on ESG in real estate, reimagining real estate investment as a positive force for change. I'm Mark Gauguier. I head up the commercial real estate team here at Farrers, and I have the honour of chairing what should be a very interesting panel discussion. This session forms part of the firm's second Entrepreneurs Week, which this year is 100% virtual. There are 25 sessions over 5 days, so it's action-packed. At Farrers, as quite a lot of you will know on this call, our focus is acting for private business, family businesses, entrepreneurs and investors. And so this week is a key element of our year. So if you could take a look when you have time at the www.entrepreneursweek.co.uk microsite, you can see more about how we work with entrepreneurs and investors, and also a chance to get involved on the social media conversation. So just a quick bit of housekeeping before we get going. Can you keep yourselves on mute just to prevent any audio feedback or disruption? There'll be an opportunity for questions at the end, towards the end of the session. So if you can use the chat box to submit any questions you have, that'd be great. We're looking to probably end the formal session at about 10 to just after, so we should have about 10 minutes at the end to pick the brains of our esteemed panel. The other thing just to mention is that the session is being recorded. We do this so that we can share it with clients and contacts later on. A recording of all our sessions and a summary of the key takeaways is available on the dedicated microsite. Again, that's www.entrepreneursweek.co.uk. So to the main event. Before we get cracking, I need to introduce our cracking panel. So first up, Harry DeFerry Foster. Harry is head of UK for Savills Investment Management. He oversees all UK pooled funds and investment mandates and is responsible for raising and investing capital in the UK. He's a busy chap, and he sits on the UK Management Committee, the ESG Committee, the Investment Risk Committee, and the Portfolio Management Committee. He's also fund director for the Charities Property Fund, a role he's held since 2007, with responsibility for all aspects of the management of the fund and ensuring the fund fulfills its objectives. Welcome. Next up, we've got Paul Sutcliffe. Paul is an executive director at Evora Global and co-founded the company, which launched in 2011. Evora has since grown from 3 founders to a leading independent and real estate sustainability consultancy with over 65 staff and offices in the UK, Germany, and Italy. Paul is a sustainability professional and has been involved in the delivery of strategic sustainability services for 20 years. Paul advises a wide array of real estate clients, from institutional investors to private equity firms and family offices, on the development and implementation of ESG strategies. Paul told me to mention that his existing engagements support the development of climate risk and opportunity strategies and the introduction of net zero carbon plans. Again, welcome. We are also very pleased to have Dr. Amy Tabari, who is a social value strategist, founder, director, co-creative. Amy helps organizations in the built environment develop and implement social value strategies. Her mission is to improve socio-economic sustainability of places, influencing decision-making in investment, development, and management of buildings and places. She has a unique set of expertise across architecture, urban planning, sociology and data analytics, and rich international consultancy and capacity building experience in architecture and urban development. She's also a guest lecturer at universities, an associated expert for Cities Forum, and co-chair of UK ULI Infrastructure and Regeneration Council. Last but not least, we have Jay Satin, who is an associate in our planning and environment team at Farrer & Co. Jay advises on standalone planning and environmental matters, as well as providing support primarily to our property corporate teams. He advises on a range of issues for our clients, including contaminated land, nuisance, waste, and permitting, to name a few. Prior to moving into law, Jay worked as an environmental consultant for 5 years, assessing and advising on the management of environmental impacts in both the development and business context. In particular, he helped businesses improve their sustainability performance and report on their improvements using the Global Reporting Initiative indicators. Welcome all. So to kick things off, a lot has been said and written about ESG, and I've lost count of the number of mail shots and articles I've been sent, received, heard, people talking at great length in very learned ways. So given that we have such an esteemed panel, I thought we'd actually start with a very simple question of what actually is ESG. And no one better really to help us with that but Paul. So Paul, maybe start with you.
Sure.
Can you provide your definition of ESG as you see it?
Well, ESG in very simple terms stands for environment, social, governance. But that doesn't really give much away. It's three words. What does it mean? Well, more specifically, it's around how organisations address or set up their governance structures to understand environment, social, and governance, environmental and social, and through that governance risks and opportunities. How they implement their strategies, and how from those strategies create management controls and measure performance to effectively manage those risks and improve performance. And from a personal perspective, I get asked this all the time, and I wouldn't. I'd advise against getting too hung up on the terminology. So many of you will have heard sustainability mentioned before, and in simple terms, and relating this to real estate, you can't have a sustainable building if it doesn't address ESG factors. So the two are, to me, it's always been broadly the same thing. And other issues, other topics you'll agenda items you may see in minutes or in discussions would be corporate social responsibility, responsible property management, responsible investments. These are all part of the approach to address your environmental and your social risks through a structured approach. So to me, that's in simple terms, it's environment, social, and governance, and how you manage those risks and opportunities.
Great, thanks. About as succinct as I think I've ever heard it. So, Amy, from your point of view, I know that you're from our discussions and what I've read and listened to from you very much focus on the S side of ESG, which is something that I think is quite often missed. And I think, if anything, people maybe understand the E and can have a go at the G, but the S is if you want the most tricky one to really pin down. So what would you say ESG is from the social perspective?
Yes, thank you. So yes, as a social value strategist, I see ESG through a lens of social value, and I prepared a bit of a diagram. Can we share that with everyone?
Should be able to.
Great. Yes, I mean, it's not a fancy diagram or anything, but it's just to kind of summarize my view of positioning of ESG in relation to social value. And as Paul was just saying, that I think that the ESG is primarily kind of, at least initially, developed as a risk management tool within the kind of business community. But with increasing awareness and interest in purpose-led business or responsible investment, and more kind of wider movement towards addressing the sustainability issue, I think ESG is also kind of starting to shift the focus from the kind of output to outcomes. So we realize that the outcomes of sustainability, whether that it's environment or more social aspects, so these are the things that now that we in the ESG debate are starting to kind of emerge as focus and as opportunities, as Paul said.
Great, thanks. It's always very interesting to hear it from a slightly different slant. And for another slant, from the fund manager's perspective, what would you say it is, Harry?
Thanks, Mark, and good afternoon, everyone. Yeah, I think I guess it's the number one question on everyone's lips to sort of put it around the other way. You know, buildings account for 40% of all CO2 emissions, whether that's, you know, through construction or through air conditioning and heating. And we spend 90% of our lives in buildings. So it's kind of, you know, it's the most important issue facing us today. And, you know, so I think from our perspective, that's why it's become so important from a fund manager's point of view.
And just sort of building on that then, having established what it is and its importance, what would you say it means, and I think staying with you, in a real estate context? What are the various components you would be looking at?
Yeah, I mean, so I suppose, how do we improve buildings, you know, to get to net carbon zero? You know, that there is obviously an obligation to do that by 2050. You know, generally we'd like to do it before then. So, you know, how do we get all our buildings to get there by, you know, 2030, say? And then in terms of, you know, what else it means. So, you know, looking at the ESG, I mean, you know, governance is, you know, all encompassing, as in, you know, so where does the money come from that wants to invest in these buildings? Is that money clean? Has it been through, you know, money laundering being quite topical in the news this morning? You know, that there are those sorts of issues around governance. You know, where do the suppliers source, you know, their product from, whether that's, you know, paper for the printers or whatever it may be. You know, the E, I think, as we spoke about, the environment has been on the agenda for some time. You know, we've had GRESB and BREEAM, I think, for almost 20 years now, you know, the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark and you know, British Research Evaluation Method. But, you know, it has been sped up in recent years, I think, by visible climate change. I think that's what's got it on everyone's agenda. You know, the social impact is slightly more difficult to measure, but, you know, I think that is, you know, what everyone wants to do now is to include that within it as well.
Yeah, I think actually, I was just going to say, segueing actually, Paul, I think I might just, because Harry touched on the S, we might just go on to Amy for this point first. Just looking again at the S, how does that play out in the real estate context as you see it?
Yeah, so first of all, I think ESG, or particularly S, in the context of real estate, as opposed to any other business industries, is that the uniqueness of the built environment's contribution to social value is the people and the places. The outcomes of our industry's activity really actually influence on people's lives. So for me, that the social sides are, say, well-being of people, social cohesion, or cultural identity, equity, and so on. And essentially what matters to people's lives, where the built environment can contribute to or influence.
Yeah, no, I think that's very interesting, and I think it does segue nicely from Harry's point. And then, Paul, back to you. I mean, for someone who helps real estate funds and investors set up their ESG strategy, how do you see it specifically within the real estate context, rather than the sort of broader context we started with?
Well, I think the first point to mention is that I've seen the agenda change and move forward rapidly over the last year almost, and the questions that we focus when we talk to our clients, when I've talked to our clients and discuss ESG, have moved on, and there used to be, well, why should I do it? Why should I address environment, social factors? Why should I establish governance controls in this way? To now, it's how do I do it, and how do I create structures and approaches to manage this almost new topic to a lot of people. And what's also really interesting is that it's not just the big institutional investors that are addressing these issues. So we see that I'm seeing consideration and questions coming from family offices and private equity firms as well. And there's a general recognition that there needs to be a structured way to addressing ESG. So, Mark, in answer to your question, I think the key point is not considering ESG as a standalone item, but creating approaches that embed within the existing structures that an organisation may have to manage their risks. And you know, to re-emphasise the point that I raised earlier, to achieve opportunities. So I strongly believe that whilst, you know, the risks are very clear, the climate change risk, the risk of physical climate change is very real and very significant. The opportunity for real estate funds, if they get their structures right, understand those risks, but importantly, those opportunities is really quite significant. And to do that, I think it needs to be embedded in processes throughout the cycle of asset management, from acquisition through to operations, through to management and even disposal. So making sure that those environment and the social side as well is understood and managed. And increasingly there are structures out there. So Harry mentioned GRESB and the BRE, BREEAM in Use, or BREEAM, as two schemes. There are many other structures. I think those structures can help, but they can also cause confusion, almost because there are too many of them. So a lot of organisations that we talk to struggle around, well, which structure should I follow? And from my perspective, it's not just about following a structure, following a system, or aligning to it. It's about understanding what risks and opportunities are relevant to your funds, your real estate vehicles, developing programs to manage those risks and opportunities, and progressing that. And then the structural side, the certifications, the recognition, that will flow from there.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I've certainly seen, which I have found fascinating and very telling, is how, you know, one would imagine, yeah, you would expect institutional investors to have to tick a box. But I think two things. One is how we seem to have moved on from box ticking to this actually becoming something of real relevance and significance, but also seeing ultra high net worth international investors being genuinely interested in this, excited by it, and seeing it as a key part of the investment criteria, where I suspect 5 to 10 years ago it just wouldn't have been on the agenda. You can imagine how it would have been for a listed propco, but it wouldn't have been for an extremely wealthy Middle East investor looking to come into the UK. And I suppose one of the reasons for that, and turning to you, Jay, and sorry we haven't asked you anything yet, but presumably a fair amount of that, of the drivers behind this, are legal. So can you just maybe talk to that for us?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so I think as Paul was mentioning, a lot of it's about awareness of risks, and we're seeing a lot more legislation coming through with the aim for getting companies and investors to disclose against those risks in relation to their ESG risks. So one of the aims being that those investing in and those managing the companies become properly aware of the risks. And another of the aims is to drive change by being more transparent about these risks. That should hopefully drive performance. You know, broadly speaking, in relation to companies, these disclosure requirements tie in with the company reporting requirements. So you have different reporting requirements according to the size of the company, or whether it's listed on a stock exchange. For example, medium-sized companies just need to disclose their risks on an annual basis, including ESG risks, whereas large companies should be disclosing those risks in a format using key performance indicators. And quoted companies have to disclose their policies and what they're doing in that area as well. There's also various climate change specific disclosure requirements that have come through, and we're seeing legislation coming through from the EU as well, primarily aimed at the investment world. So we've got the taxonomy regulations, which are aimed at sustainable environmental objectives, and those which have to meet a certain standard according to technical screening. So those are aimed at their activities, and they have to promote a certain environmental objective. And we've also got the disclosure regulations as well, which are aimed at the investors themselves, who have to start disclosing about what they're doing in relation to integrating ESG considerations in their investments. And aside from disclosure, we've also got legislation that looks at performance. So there's minimum energy efficiency standards for landlords that they have to comply with at certain lease trigger dates. We've got the energy savings opportunities scheme, which requires energy audits to be carried out. On the social side, there's the Modern Slavery Act, which is aimed at various companies having to look down their supply chain. So there's a lot of legal drivers. There's a lot being done in this area, which is pushing it higher up on the agenda.
And I suppose looking to you, Harry, as an investor, and building on your earlier comments, why do you think there is an increased focus on ESG now in the real estate industry? I mean, you and I have worked together for a long time, and certainly this wasn't really a buzzword back in, as far as I was aware, back in say 2005, but now this is very much a thing.
Yeah, I agreed, and I think there are obviously push and pull factors, I think. So I mean, as you've rightly just illustrated, with legislation, whether that's from the EU, which even though in theory we're meant to be leaving the EU, I suspect we're going to still be tied by those legislations. I suspect we'll adopt them, or whether it's UK. The very basic levels, energy performance certificates. If you have a building that is F or G rated, you can't let it, you can't sell it. So therefore, it's going to impact you, and it's important. And over time, buildings tend to, their energy performance tends to reduce. So, and because of that, there's a risk if you don't upgrade or improve buildings. So seen a change to obviously LED lighting, which is 80% more efficient than lighting that we had previously. You may end up having assets which are stranded. So no one wants to have assets that are stranded because you're not going to be able to sell them, or they're not going to be worth as much. And these are all the sort of push factors. And then planning permission. Whenever you go for a new planning on new development, you've got to abide by the highways plans and employ apprenticeships, and so there's all these things which are actually forcing you to be more energy efficient and so on. And I think so you can't really get away from it, I guess, on one side. And then I think on the other side, there's the increasing desire, to do the right thing. People have got more of a social conscience. I mean, we've talked about, mentioned climate change, but I do think, there's the sort of wildfires, the melting ice caps, the plastics, these have all been like really, pounced upon because they're so, they're just so obvious or all over front page news for us. And then on top of that, because of that, I guess, you've got the sources of capital, the major sources of capital are now demanding it. So if you go to, listen to Blackstone or BlackRock or Schroders, or, governments will push pension funds to only invest in things which are, mindful of ESG, and not just mindful, but, are actually actively carrying it out. So you won't raise capital either. So there's a legal push side, and then there's doing the right thing, and then there's the investor pull side.
Okay, so if I were an investor, how would I go about building and implementing my ESG portfolio and strategy, both in terms of acquiring new properties and increasing the ESG credentials of what I or we already have? Paul, starting with you, how would you go about helping someone develop that strategy?
Well, ideally, Mark, I'd start from start right at the beginning, and do it from the start. So if you're raising, if you've raised capital, or you have a fund that isn't invested yet, or yeah, you have finance that isn't invested in real estate yet, sort of develop structures and programs that enable you to understand your legal risks, your physical risks, the term that we hear mentioned is transition risk, which is transition to a green economy. Set your plans in place and understand what you're going to do, and then wrap that into the process of developing your vehicle, your fund. And that would be through acquisition. So how do you understand and evaluate the risks and the opportunities during acquisition? And so that can look at the issues that are already, especially in the UK, covered quite well. So contaminated land, flood risk, etc. But historically, these assessments, these contaminated land assessments, have always looked backwards. They've looked at how frequent is a flood event going to happen? What has happened on this site? And what we know with climate change is the world's changing, so that the pace of these risks is increasing. So there needs to be a forward-looking lens to that process. And that again is very risk focused. But the other aspect that I would look at and recommend when you're considering acquisitions is opportunity. So how can you make a difference? How can you contribute positively to the environment and the social aspects? And this is environmental factors could be. It depends what you want to do with the asset. Is it a development fund? Is it a standing investment that's going to stay there with tenants? How can you improve those assets? So it might be technical, it might be energy related, or indeed it might be focused on social. And this is something that Amy can clearly comment in more detail than I can. But one of the things that we've started looking at and supporting our clients to do is to align their acquisition processes with the UN, United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, to look at how the activities of managing those assets can contribute to these broad goals, which sets out broad objectives for improvement. And then not just once you've acquired it, how do you manage and operate and develop and enhance that asset to deliver enhanced ESG performance? And finally, the last bit is how do you measure it to prove that it's happened? So check your risks and opportunities at the start, manage to deliver, and then review, create the appropriate metrics to measure effectiveness.
Measurement's a very interesting point, which we'll come on to in a minute. But just flipping from the advisory to the principal side, how have you found it developing the strategy, Harry?
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, I mean, so we've had the benefit of running, I guess, the largest ethical property fund in the UK for the last 20 years, which I've had the sort of privilege to work on. So, and as you say, when we started that off, it was quite groundbreaking in a way, because we had, negative tenant screening. So obviously the fund had an ethical stance. It's purely for charities. And I think, as you say, probably in about 2005 or just after then actually there became this sort of groundswell of wanting to do a bit more, actually. And that's when we really started pushing, obviously we're engaging with the tenants before that, but really engaging with them from an ESG perspective to try and make improvements to those buildings. And I think, since then we've demonstrably been able to improve, I think, about 50% of our buildings over the last 10 years. You do need a framework, as Paul said. The measurement will come on to carbon zero we've talked about. I mean, some of it, is intuitive in terms of, being able to make it, these improvements to buildings, whether that's, electric charging points or, solar powered, solar panels helping to reduce the energy consumption. I think traditionally it has been difficult to engage with occupiers a little bit. But, some of them are sort of giving you the brush off, but I don't think that's is any longer an excuse as to why you're not doing this.
Interesting stuff. And Amy, do you have any thoughts on strategy development and implementation on your side, on the social perspective?
Yes, I think that so where I work in this kind of social domain, the challenge is that you can't. It's very difficult, as everyone already mentioned, that it's very difficult to kind of define and measure in terms of a kind of social aspect of performance. And I think that there is a space for judgment. So you can't try to achieve everything because you can't define everything in the first place. So there are two things that are really important. One is that as an organization, whether you're an investor or the fund manager, to have your own, say, mission or values, that what you want to do as an organization. So you might be passionate about a particular aspect of SDG, well-being or equality, or something that you might have feel strongly about as an organization. And I think it's okay to have that kind of your own framework as a matter of kind of prioritization. But at the same time, it has to be relevant. So you need to understand the local needs. So that would be project by project. In each asset, each area of development, you have different local needs. So it's about having a framework, a strategy to identify these overlaps where it makes sense to you as an organization, but it also makes sense in that local context as outcomes.
And where have you seen this work particularly well? In what sort of context?
That's a very interesting question. Well, I think it is happening in many developments individually, but some developers, some investors have a strong mind, but I think the problem is that in the industry that it's not it's not a common practice. So we are relying on individual organizations to implement that. For example, if you look at in London, King's Cross Argents, this is quite often used as a case study example, but I think that King's Cross Development, they have actually managed to address community needs as well as achieving some degree of financial performance.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really interesting, because as a firm, we've worked on a number of legacy developments, and actually one of the key drivers tends to be the community. And it's not just about the direct financial reward, it's kind of the indirect financial, because actually if you've got a happy community and a settled community, nothing attracts a crowd like a crowd. And so I mean that is something that we've changed immeasurably over the last few years, but both in a residential and in a commercial context. So thank you for that. Jay, do you have anything to add on implementing from the, I suppose, more from the lawyer's side?
Yeah, well, I think, just speaking more broadly about it, when you're implementing the strategy, I think you want to be thinking about the quality of the information you're going to be able to obtain about the environmental, social, and governance factors that you're interested in. You'll be looking at the scope of review, how far that, are you going to drill down into that information? Will you be looking at, for example, the materials in the building that you'll be investing in? And in turn, the other main factor here, more on the legal side, is the level of control you'll be able to exercise over the building. So, on day one, if you acquire a real estate investment and it meets the standard that you want it to, will it still be at that standard, 1 year down the line or a few years down the line? So I think there you'll be thinking, well, the type of buildings you want to look for, broadly speaking, might be newer buildings, as Harry was alluding to, in terms of planning controls here and building regulations. But would you also be looking to acquire potentially an older building where you might have more potential, well, an older building which you have potential to upgrade and to refurbish. I think speaking more about control here as well, you'll be thinking about the lease and what control you have under that lease with the tenants. So, for example, there's been a lot of talk over the last few years about green leases and potentially the lack of take-up of those green leases. So that those are leases where you have various obligations in them, where you'll be saying to the tenants that they can't, for example, carry out specific works to the property which would reduce its environmental standards, and you could potentially broaden that to, you know, potentially social standards as well, or even governance factors as well. But now with all the reporting requirements that are coming through for investors, will they have to be starting to actually say, as a landlord, no, we have to have this form of leasing because we're going to be disclosing our ESG risks. We need to have a control over the level of information coming through to us about that building on an ongoing basis. We also need to make sure that it doesn't drop below a certain standard. So I think we will see more of a take-up of these types of leases, because it's going to have to come more of a red line when investors are getting involved.
Thank you. So having looked at various aspects of ESG, the one that I know everyone dreads is maybe the wrong word, but the most difficult is measuring the success of an ESG strategy. So Amy, rather cruelly, I'm going to look at you, I'm going to turn to you first. And I know you've touched on measurement, but how do you measure the success of an ESG strategy?
Yeah, so well, I think that there are, it's clearly a very challenging area, and but I think we at the stage, as an industry, I think we're at the stage of really exploring. And first of all, I think there are different stages where the measurement can be applied. I think the most obvious one is the actual measuring outcomes. And even that, having said that, it's very difficult because you first need to define what do we actually want to measure. But another challenge in our industry is that if it's a development project, it takes a while for us to be able to actually measure, because when you're working on things, when you're making certain decisions, whether in investment or the development design decisions, from there to the completion of the development and actually that place being occupied, it might take 5 or 10 years. So it's very difficult to have a very useful set of measures that can be reflected upon the decision making in the first place. So where I focus on is the measures which can be used as design tools or decision making tools, which are slightly separate. Well, it's very different nature from actually measuring impact. So it is to using the predictive modeling techniques, you can actually start to align your decision making to a certain outcomes, but they're not necessarily the accurate forecasts. And there is a danger in just focusing on the outcome measures, although I understand why they are important for, especially for investors, to have kind of clear evidence. But I think there are also different types of measures to be discussed.
That's very interesting. And Paul, same question to you. And I suppose as a supplemental, is there enough standardization to compare different organizations?
I think measuring success is one of the biggest challenges that we do have. As far as standardization goes, I think it's really important, especially given the focus on real estate of this session, to mention GRESB. So GRESB is the Global Real Estate Sustainability Benchmark. and it's increasingly popular. It's a membership, so investors, real estate investors can join, and it simply put, it's a benchmark system where every year individual funds or entities participate. They answer questions, they submit evidence. That evidence is scored, and all real estate vehicles are given a rating, a percentage score, and also a number of stars. So 5 is the best, 1 is the worst. And that what is really interesting is, and it's both a strength and a challenge, is that the one-size-fits-all benchmark. So it aids comparison, but it also limits the ability of certain funds, for example, find it harder to score in GRESB than others. So if you've got a fund that has a lot of indirectly managed assets where the tenants are responsible for the data collection and potentially refurbishment activities as well, then and historically that data has been difficult to get hold of from the fund managers and the asset managers, and as a result of that, the ability to answer GRESB effectively is restricted. So that's a one-size-fits-all approach. The other key point I would, in terms of frameworks, there's an important framework that we've not really touched on yet, which isn't real estate specific but needs to be recognised and considered, is something called TCFD, which is the Task Force for Financial Related Climate Disclosures, and that creates a methodology, a series of considerations that need to be put into place. But it doesn't give you the guidance of exactly what has to happen. That's for you to identify your risks, what's material to you, what are material risks and opportunities, and to create those structures from governance, strategy, management, and measurement. And ultimately, there will be some similarities. So GRESB creates similarity, but there needs to be recognition in the industry that different funds will have different impacts, and as Amy mentioned earlier, will be located in different areas, so need to consider the risks and opportunities relevant to themselves. And what I found interesting on this call is, no one said these are the things you have to do to be sustainable. These are the things you have to do to have an excellent ESG fund or real estate vehicle, because it doesn't work like that. It's got to be tailored to the relevant risks and opportunities of that entity.
And just moving from that to the actual poor fund manager who has to stand up at the AGM every year, or sit down, and answer difficult questions on this. Harry?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Paul said it, and well, Amy as well. I mean, it's difficult. It's not straightforward. I mean, property is unique, so they are. Ultimately, it's all different. I mean, GRESB is a tool that has been adopted by the industry. It is a useful tool. You can measure yourself against it. I think most people sort of end up saying, it's trying to explain why they're either wildly above or wildly below the average, because there's normally a reason behind that. And Paul touched on a few of them there, being, single let properties and so on, and you would score much lower for than actual properties you can manage. And that comes actually back to Amy's point about Argent, and probably the same applies to, say, Poundbury or to Carnaby Street or some of the big estates. If you have one big development site, or if your portfolio is concentrated in one place, it's actually much more straightforward to make changes that benefit everyone, because say you're going to develop some wellness like Argent, you're going to put in some public space and some fountains. Actually you're getting enormous benefit of that because you own the surrounding 500 buildings. It's very difficult to do that where you own one warehouse on an estate in outside Birmingham. That there's no real incentive for you to do that, and it's not financially helpful to do that. Whereas in Poundbury it makes sense for to have all the the artisans to produce the houses, which all look very, very nice, and it encourages the sort of sum of the parts is or the whole is greater than some of the parts. I mean, ultimately, performance in terms of getting to net zero carbon, we're going to get measured on the capital we raise. I guess ultimately people aren't going to give us their money to invest if we're not going to abide by these, not just the rules and regulations, but actually embrace the spirit of it as well, I think.
Excellent, thank you. So to wrap things up, I was just going to ask each of you in turn, briefly, no more than a minute, what are your sort of final thoughts on what's going on in the next few years, but also within that, any particular threats and opportunities, bearing in mind that this is sort of focused towards entrepreneurs, and whether there was anything specific that you had to add on that. Harry, as you're on the screen, do you want to lead?
Thanks, Alan. Yeah, I mean, we see massive opportunities, really. And actually, I mean, we're in the process of, not that I kind of, sort of feel like I'm going on radio to sort of pitch my own book or something, but, we're in the process of sort of launching a new fund specifically for this, because I just think this is the way everything is going. The new green, clean economy, particularly coming out of COVID-19, which, we haven't even actually spoken about yet today. But, wellness and, actually looking at, so looking at things like, electric battery production, lithium battery production, halogen light production, areas we really like are things like, vertical farming. So, we were speaking the other day to one of the largest, I think it's the owner of the largest vertical farm in Europe, which is in Lincolnshire. And they grow 10 stories high within the warehouse, so they can produce 100 times more in that warehouse what you can produce on the same piece of land. They have a renewable, it's powered by renewable energy, needs no pesticides. It's effectively produced where it's going to be consumed. So there's no slave labor, there's no pesticides, that the energy has all been renewable, and actually it's an incredibly good use of land. And then actually looking at Brexit, which is another thing we haven't mentioned, it obviously gives you food security and tackles import duties as well. So, just think there's real opportunities here. It's quite a big, I mean, COVID-19 has been quite a big change in itself in terms of looking at what's happening in the office market. And I think there's a real opportunity here to actually now produce buildings and look at industries and technologies that are really going to be here for years and years to come, which actually will adopt all these, certainly all the E and the S of ESG.
Amy?
Yes. Yes, I also think that this is a very exciting time, that the very fact that we are here to talk about ESG, and we all kind of agreeing that the actual material impacts are really important, not only box ticking exercise. So I think, especially from S point of view, it's still, for example, GRESB, which was mentioned earlier. When it comes to S, they are still kind of policy level. Do you have policies on this or that? And so they basically asking for intentions. Do you have intention of bringing good social outcomes? And I think it's time for us to really think about actual how do we do it and what do we do it? What do we do? And so these are the debates that has to happen within individual organizations as well as in every project. And I hope that is going to be more of a common practice.
Paul?
Yeah, I think when it comes to ESG in real estate, there are two key pinch points: raising capital. So if you're going out to raise money, the investor world want to know that the capital that they give you to invest in real estate is being sustainably invested, appropriately addressed, and all the risks and opportunities are being addressed. So having a strategy that addresses that is really important. And the second one is on sale, is disposal. So if you're looking to sell and transact on an asset and it doesn't meet the legal requirements, or it's on the boundary of legal requirements, then that could have an impact. Well, it will have an impact on value, and And this is why I think we're seeing the family offices and the private equity firms starting to look at ESG seriously, because I have some clients who have value add strategies, and those strategies that take assets that are below below institutional grade and bring them up to institutional grade, and then over a period of years, and then sell them on into the institutional markets for real estate. And they cannot do that if they haven't put the structures in place, if they don't know what is happening in terms of ESG. So those two pinch points need to be addressed. Yes, there are points along the way, so telling the story, reporting on progress, but it's kind of linked to those key reference points. And I think I see over the next this topic is not going away. So over the next 5 years, we'll see rapid growth in awareness. I think there'll be we're not really touched on in any great detail collecting data and understanding data just from an energy point of view and a sustainability point of view. That really needs to evolve and improve, and that will involve greater partnership with tenants and other stakeholders that might be involved. So yeah, this is structure is needed. This topic's not going away.
Finally, Jay.
Yeah, we're just from the legal side looking to the future. I'd say in terms of a threat, there's a point that Paul just alluded to, would be the quality of the information or data that's coming through about that links up with the ESG performance. So obviously I was talking about the various mandatory reporting requirements, but in terms of reporting on ESG risks, but it's the data behind those risks as well, which will be important, because there have previously been situations where the regulator has got involved and gone after companies who haven't properly disclosed on their ESG risks. We've also seen situations where sustainability rating agencies have rated particular companies highly, whereas actually they've been found to have certain incidents where actually, it would draw that into question, making you think, the data they're being presented, is it actually independently verified, for example? And moving forward, in terms of an opportunity, I was talking about leases, and I think recently there was a lease where Poolbrook and Gould signed a new lease with the land, a green lease with the landlord, Grosvenor, Britain and Ireland, and this was a lot more about information sharing as well. So if you're starting to have these leases come forward where, for example, there'll be forums set up where both parties can share best practice guidance and information between the two, then this should hopefully drive forward the ESG agenda, and both parties can realise a win-win from these situations.
Excellent stuff. Now we've got about 5 minutes left, and we've got a few questions. A couple have been sent to me privately, which are quite pithy. I'm not sure whether we'll get onto those, but let us take one from Graham Chase. Further benchmarking simply creates an elite class of property which will not be representative of the UK property stock as a whole, and consequently will create more difficulties rather than solve the environmental issues that now face us. Who fancies tackling that?
Well, I'll have a very, very quick go at this, or start the process. I think if you think about GRESB, GRESB can create a barrier. So for the funds and the entities and the organisations that have been involved in participating in GRESB, they understand what it's looking for. They understand the structure and the requirements of the questions that are needed. And those real estate organisations that haven't got there yet have a challenge in effectively catching up. And so more benchmarking, I can completely see the point of view expressed in the question, and also that the challenge is that more benchmarking could, if unstructured, pose those threats. The one point I would raise is that I personally don't think, as an industry, we should get too bogged down by the benchmarking point, and it's more about making sure that the risks and the opportunities are understood in the management of the funds and the vehicles that we're talking about. So what environment and social issues need to be addressed? How do we take those forwards? How do we manage risks and opportunities? That to me is more important than the benchmarking exercise.
Anyone else want to jump in on that?
Yeah, hi Mark. Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think Paul made a very good point of, it's important when you buy and when you sell, and there are legal barriers here that people have got to be aware of. I agree. I think that the benchmarking itself is, I think it is helpful and it's quite institutional, but actually it's more the kind of awareness. We talked about the intuitive nature of it, and the need that the legislation there is in terms of buying and not being left with stranded assets. And I think that's the important point to focus on. But people are obviously going to benchmark it, but I'm not sure everyone's going to perhaps go down that, because as Paul says, there is a barrier to joining that.
Separately, I got a private question which I quite like, which actually you mentioned, Harry, that we've managed to get through this without talking about really either COVID or Brexit. Taking the first of those, COVID, the slump that may follow COVID, how is that going to impact ESG?
That's a good question. I mean, to be fair, all I would say is that I think COVID-19 has actually sort of elevated. I mean, a lot of people, we've heard the word accelerated quite a lot. The consciousness of a need for addressing some of these issues with the climate, with globalization. We've seen why the pandemic's happened, and it's from sort of, well, I kind of get political about it, but the cause of it, is and its spread, can be related back to the world we've kind of built around us, which I think everyone is suggesting that ought to be changed. So whether that's some onshoring of like I was saying before, food kind of security, whether it's onshoring of manufacturing, whether it's wider sort of deeper supply chains or more expanded supply chains. But in some respects, a lot of that is beneficial for the UK. If we're going to build more storage here, we're going to have more manufacturing here, we're going to have more farming production here, to basically kind of de-risk some of those supply chains. That, in theory, could be a kickstart for growth here. I appreciate we're going to be heavily indebted, and that's not ideal, but I don't see why those underlying things should change.
Anyone else got anything to add to that excellent answer?
Me? Sorry.
Yes,
Good. Yes, I think that the pandemic really highlighted the relationship between the real estate and kind of social needs. And it really highlighted, if there is anything that it really highlighted, that the real estate industry, in the first place, I think it has to be relevant to what society needs. And so, for example, Max talks about the topic of a work from home, the increase of the work from home. So, the city centre offices might not necessarily be the same after COVID, when the lifestyle patterns, work patterns are going to change. But I think it's also important to emphasize that the not only the kind of direct response to the needs in society, but we also need to balance that with the environmental performance as well. So, for example, if we follow people's needs, people want to have a bigger house with gardens, and they want to spread out. They don't want to be in the city center, and naturally that is going to basically encourage almost like a sprawl, and people wants to build houses in where nobody else is doing at the moment. But if we allow that to happen as an industry, the urban footprint is going to expand, and that is not going to be necessarily productive for the environmental, tackling the environmental challenge. So I think as an industry, we need to bear in mind that one, we have to be relevant to social needs. Second, but at the same time, as professionals, we have responsibility to really balance all these different, sometimes conflicting requirements.
Okay, I'm conscious it's now 2 minutes past 3. We've got some really excellent questions, and I think what I'll do is probably email those on to the panel, who can then send me responses as they see fit, and I can try and send them to, I can see Jack smiling there, who asked an excellent question that I would have enjoyed seeing everybody squirm with. But so we will we will try and follow those up. But that was a fascinating session. Real sort of world-class insight. I mean, it's, as I can't remember who said it, but it is very much here to stay, and there are obviously going to be some very interesting opportunities. So thank you very much to all the panelists for their excellent contributions. If we could clap, I'm sure we all would, but so virtual clap. And thank you very much to everybody tuning in. And Graham has put on, in fact, a virtual clap, of course. As I say, this will be this will go on to our micro site, and I'm going to circulate it around social media. And please feel free to send it on, because I think this is obviously such a hot topic, and actually it's a very interesting debate, and as good as we can do with not being in the flesh. So thank you very much to all again, and I just put a plug for looking at the entrepreneurs microsite that I mentioned earlier, because it is good. There are some really good things happening. I think the final session is a more sort of social, jolly, convivial affair, which I'm going to try and get onto if I can. But everybody's welcome, so do have a look at that if you can. Okay, thank you very much all, and enjoy the rest of your days. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.